Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Owens. We're in week 8. It's amazing. Just a few weeks left before the end of the term. We just finished up our section on identities in sport. We talked a lot about social identities in sport when it comes to race, gender, class, sexual orientation. We're talking about religion this week. And so I want to kind of wrap things up when we're talking about identities in sport with this brief lecture, just to kind of bring us all together on the same page. So before we get into the heart of this lecture, I think it's important that we define social identity. So here's a definition from Jenkins. It's the ways in which individuals and collectives are distinguished in their social relations with other individuals and collectives, as a systematic establishment and signification between individuals, between collectives, and between individuals and collectives of relationships of similarity and difference. Now that definition is a mouthful. Basically, what Jenkins is saying is that social identity is different than personal identities that we have, and that social identities exist through social interaction. So things such as race, such as class, such as gender could not exist without social interactions. And so, like I said, we talked about the past 4 weeks, social identities in sport and physical culture. We talked about race, ethnicity, and social class. We talked about gender and how gender is sometimes performed, gender performativity. We talked about age and ability, or age and disability. And then this week we are focusing on religion and spirituality. Now, religion and spirituality works on multiple levels, right? So we can talk about religion not only as an identity, we can also talk about it in terms of religious institutions. And I know starting next week, we're actually getting into institutions in sport where we'll talk about the media, where we will talk about politics, and where we'll talk about education. So I am going to create a separate lecture on religion that I'll finish up in a couple of days and post to Web Campus, because religion is a very important topic for us to consider as applied sport and performance psychology practitioners, right? Especially when we're working with clients, because athletes or performers' faith might be a very strong component of their identity and how they perform their sport. And we'll talk about that later. But to get back to today's topic, one of the areas that Coakley doesn't talk about a lot in his work is this notion of intersectionality. Now, if you have not heard of this term, you will. It's almost impossible not to hear this term when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in sport. So I just wanted to give us just a short history of intersectionality, where it comes from, and then talk about how it's been applied in sport and psychology settings. So the term itself was started back actually in the late 70s, early 80s by a Black feminist lesbian group called the Combahee River Collective. And they released a statement in 1978 to kind of promote Black feminism. Basically, what they were saying is that white feminists were not doing enough in terms of race. They also were saying that when Black men talk about race, we talk about it in ways that don't undermine patriarchy. So we might say, yes, we're, as Black men, that we are oppressed by white people, but we're not trying to dismantle patriarchy. It's almost like we want to be part of patriarchy, is what some Black feminists argued, right? And so that's where this intersectionality first began. The term was first mentioned in American culture It was later appropriated by Kimberly Crenshaw Williams, a legal scholar in the early 1990s, and she defined intersectionality as the various ways in which race and gender interact to shape the multiple dimensions of Black women's experiences. She's a great YouTube video out there, TED Talk, that if you have not seen it, I encourage you to watch it. I use it in the diversity and culture course that I teach for the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, where she makes a very cogent point that when we are talking about race, we're oftentimes talking about Black men and not Black women, and uses the example of police shootings, and that how many of us, white, Black, or otherwise in American culture, can name many of the young Black men that have been killed by police officers, but it's hard for us to name many of the women. That may be changing now with like Breonna Taylor. And this video was created before the Breonna Taylor incident. The video that Dr. Crenshaw created or was before the Breonna Taylor incident. But again, like, she does make a cogent point that oftentimes when we talk about race, and particularly for this class, when we talk about race in sport, we have a tendency to think about Black male athletes. Patricia Hill Collins also adopted the term in the 1990s, and she talked about intersectionality as a form of interlocking matrices of oppression. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So how have we talked about intersectionality in sport? Intersectionality, we can think about it in a couple different ways. One of the first articles that appeared discussing intersectionality in sport was an article that was published in the Sociology of Sport journal, and it was about Jennifer Harris, who's there here in the center photo. And Jennifer Harris played basketball at Penn State under Coach Rennie Portland. And Coach Portland had 3 rules: no drinking, no drugs, no lesbians. And if you haven't seen it, you should probably check out the documentary Training Rules. It's definitely an eye-opening experience. But Harris was released from the team because Coach perceived her to be a lesbian. And in court, Harris's attorneys made the argument that Harris is racially discriminated against. And they based that argument on the idea that Harris herself does not identify as a lesbian, and that Coach perceived her as a lesbian not because she saw Harris interacting with another female in that way. It's because she perceived Harris to be a lesbian because of Harris's Blackness, the way she wore her hair, the hip-hop clothes that she wore. And so they argued that this is a form of racism, not just homophobia. And so you can see where I'm going here, maybe. If not, I'll tell you. When we're talking about intersectionality in sport, and it goes back to Collins's, what I said, the interlocking matrices of oppression, when it comes to multiple marginalized identities, these things shouldn't be just viewed as individual oppressions, right? We can't just view racial oppression as racial oppression when there's also gender oppression. Those things interact. We just can't view racial discrimination as racial discrimination when there's also sexual discrimination or discrimination based on one's sexual orientation or their ability, because these things interlock and they affect people in different ways. And that's actually one of the limitations about intersectionality, is this whole notion of affect. And I'll get to affect here in a second. We can also talk about intersectionality in terms of Other Black women's experiences in sport. We have Cassius Semenya, the South African middle distance runner who's also intersexed. We have Anjali Forber-Pratt, who was actually the diversity speaker at the 2020 Association for Applied Sports Psychology conference. She is a Paralympic or former Paralympic athlete that's now teaching at a university in Tennessee. And so we can talk about the intersections of race and gender and ability when we talk about athletes. Now, some of you may know that I'm actually a guest editor on a special issue of the Journal for Clinical Sports Psychology, and it's entitled Embracing Intersectionality, right? And so for me, intersectionality is a very important concept, I think, for all of us as performance psychology practitioners to know and understand. But intersectionality also, like any other theoretical framework, has its limits. One area that I personally believe where it has become limited is when it has been applied to populations that it wasn't originally meant to be applied to, meaning that, the whole idea comes out of intersectionality, comes out of Black feminist thought and Black feminist scholarship. And so when we begin to apply it outside of that framework, I think is when it can sometimes become a slippery slope. And that particularly, I think, when we try to apply it to Black male athletes, right? And I'll talk about my reasons for that here in a second. So one of the areas that I've been interested in for a while is this notion of affect and the affective turn. Now, the affective turn comes from social theory. It's been around since at least the 80s. So it's not something new, but it is something new to cultural sports psychology as well as other areas of diversity and inclusion within applied sport and performance psychology settings. And so I want to discuss it a little bit. So when we're talking about affect, we're talking about a change or variation. And that's what we need to focus on, those two words, a change and variation. That occurs when bodies collide or come into contact. And affect occurs, it's based on the premise that any interaction, or not just any interaction, but all interactions have the ability to affect bodies in positive and negative ways. So I think of the term microaggression. I'm sure many of you have heard it. If you haven't, it's basically the everyday slight that occurs, that are experienced by people in marginalized groups from people in the majority group, right? So if someone says to someone who's Asian American, "Oh, or just assumes, oh, you're really smart," that, or it assumes that Asian Americans are the model minority, that's a microaggression, right? And so the difference in why I've moved over the years from intersectionality, and I think intersectionality is great. I think that it's important for all of us to have a basic understanding of intersectionality. But once you get your grounding in intersectionality and you understand it, I encourage you to also add affect to your thinking and your thoughts, right? Because intersectionality basically says that we have all these identities that, people, marginalized groups have identities that can collide, right? So a Black woman, her racial identity can collide with her gender, with maybe her sexual orientation, maybe with her faith. So all these things kind of intersect and they collide. And sometimes as a person, as an athlete, you don't know, you don't know why you're being discriminated against. Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm Black? Right? You may So it's hard to disaggregate those things from each other, right? They're so interlocked. But affect takes it a step further and doesn't just look at the crash. It doesn't look just at the collision. It looks at what was the change? How was that person changed? Or how are both of those people changed through that interaction, right? What happened there? And so we're assuming that bodies and identities are relational, not static. We're assuming that bodies and identities are continuously reproduced in relation to material and social forces. And that's really important because one of the things that we sometimes assume, particularly from an intersectional perspective, is that social identities are socially constructed. I said that earlier, that's the definition of it, is that social identities are socially constructed, right? And if we take that to an extreme, it also creates this underlying assumption that everything is socially created, that things don't exist outside of the social, right? Where the exact opposite of that, essentialism, says, oh no, there are essential things out there. Men are naturally masculine. Men have testosterone. That's what gives us our masculine characteristics. So that's an essentialist perspective. Whereas social construction would say, oh, no, gender is socially constructed. You learn to become a man or you learn to perform your masculinity, right? What the affective turn says is based on this notion of what's called new materialism, is that there's a range, right? It depends on the circumstance that you're talking about. So yes, identities are socially constructed. We know that race would not exist outside of humans' creation of race. But we also know that people of certain skin tones, particularly in America, have experienced oppression, right? That there's a material consequence in America for most of us if you inhabit a black or brown body, right? And so the affect recognizes this. And so the affective turn argues that instead of thinking about all of this stuff as identities, we need to think about them as assemblages, that people are this kind of ensemble of social identities as well as material things. So you can have a black male athlete who might be naturally gifted in certain ways, and still be discriminated against, or still not reach his full potential in terms of an athletic career. The affective turn again looks at things both from a negative and positive light, right? So the affective turn also asks, well, what can a body do? And this is something too that intersectionality suggests, but it doesn't really delve into this, because intersectionality is all about oppression, how people are oppressed based on their marginalized identities. It doesn't necessarily, intersectionality doesn't necessarily ask the question about what can people do? What can these bodies do, these marginalized bodies do in order to resist their oppression? So that leads me into my last slide here, where I'm going to talk just briefly about the cool pose. The cool pose is defined as a strategy that Black men have used to protect themselves from vulnerabilities associated with discrimination, oppression, and the harsh environment of the inner city. This term actually comes to us from Richard Majors. He was writing about the cool pose back in the 1990s, but I'm citing Jackson's a more recent study that's referring to the cool pose. Majors, even though when he was originally writing about the cool pose, he was writing about it outside of sport, he has written briefly about it in sport, and basically says that the cool pose in sport can sometimes be interpreted as a cultural resistance to racism. Black males' appropriation of sport is an example of human agency operating within structural constraints. And basically, what Majors is telling us is that black male bodies have agency when it comes to sport, right? Yes, we have been oppressed, but we can use what our bodies can do in order to act within the structural limitations or constraints that have been posed to us from sporting institutions. Okay. And so with that, I'm going to conclude this lecture at 20 minutes. But again, as I mentioned before, I will be posting another lecture on religion and sport in a few days.